to Canton, Campus to Canton on the Better Sports Network.
You cannot talk about college football today without talking about conference realignment. And the ACC is no different. We're going to get into the ACC preview. It's Felix, Sharpe, and Nicholas Ian Allen at CFB Winning Edge on Twitter. This is the Campus2Canton show on Better Sports Network. Florida State looks like they want to leave. They want to join the SEC too. They want that $20 million per year with that those streaming rights. They want it too. We're not going to get into that. If you are uninitiated, we're a fantasy show. We play in Campus2Canton leagues. We play in college fantasy leagues. Our perspective and our discussions on this show are more player-centric than traditional legacy media's program-centric discussions. We focus on the players here because we're using them in our fantasy leagues. And Nick, when I look at the ACC, there are a couple of questions for the conference overall that really stand out. One is Florida State for real, contender or pretender? According to the C2C Winning Edge package, the team profiles there at Campus2Canton.com, Nick, I see these numbers. I see number 4 in returning production, and I know some of these names. Jordan Travis, widely considered a Heisman candidate. Trey Benson, the transfer from Oregon, who's now there in Mike Norvell's backfield. We love Mike Norvell, running backs. He's good. Johnny Wilson and Keon Coleman present 2 wide receiver towering figures there in college football for Jordan Travis to throw to. And then Jaheim Bell is so athletic that he was playing running back at South Carolina last year, and now he's playing tight end. And, oh, by the way, in a lot of mock drafts last season, I saw Jared Verse, somewhere like in the top 24 or so picks, and he decided to go back to school. Number 4 in returning production. Nicholas Ian Allen, how do you answer that question? Is Florida State a contender or a pretender?
I think Florida State is legitimately a contender. I was a little bit surprised actually where our CFB Winning Edge team strength rating came in. Florida State's only 14th right now in my power rankings. But they do, and you ran, down all the talent that they've got on hand, and the schedule, it's got a couple of really tough matchups early in the year, LSU and Clemson, but there's no team that is unbeatable. And we've seen, guys like Johnny Wilson take over a game. We've seen Jordan Travis take over a game. It's one of those teams, one of those, depth charts on both sides of the ball where there really is no major weakness. And I truly do believe, could match up with any team in the country on a particular Saturday night or whenever, and find a way to win that game. So, over the course of a long season, it's going to be tough to go through unscathed. But I do believe they've got a path to the ACC championship game. You win that, and there's an opportunity potentially to get into the playoff and work your way to the national championship. I do think that is a possibility for Florida State, but as far as being one of those elite teams that we really expect to get there, they're a little outside of that, at least as far as my projections and power ratings go.
Seminoles fans at CFB Winning Edge, if you want to send your hate mail on Twitter. Florida State starts off with a doozy in week 1 with LSU. That game was a classic last year. Florida State now, it seems like they want to win the SEC championship, trying to get to the SEC either next year or some point in the future. They get the rematch this year with LSU. One of the just a great week 1 non-conference matchup. I think in 2023, actually even before, in 2022, in the years since Trevor Lawrence and Deshaun Watson have left Clemson, in my opinion, has been exposed just a bit. Now, Dabo Swinney is one of these coaches that preaches loyalty. He promotes from within. And this year is the first year that he's gone outside of that philosophy to improve his offensive production. He goes against Garrett Riley from TCU. TCU just in the national championship last year to give Clemson an offensive spark. Clemson's in one of these blue blood schools. Actually, I don't even know if I would call them a blue blood because their success is more recent. Blue blood is for schools that have a little more history. But Clemson is one of these schools that is always going to be a top recruiting program. They've got an Elite 11 MVP in Cade Klubnik playing there at wide receiver, from Adam Randall to Bo Collins to Antonio Williams. I mean, Adam Randall is probably the third guy on this list, and he's 6'3", 220 pounds, and runs a 4.4 40-yard dash. That's even after tearing his ACL and coming back in like 8 months. They bring in Garrett Riley, as I mentioned, from TCU. Garrett Riley had, Max Duggan as a Heisman Trophy candidate, and Quentin Johnston was a top 15 NFL draft pick to the Chargers. Do you see him changing things? Is this going to become exciting football again for Clemson?
Yeah, I think it certainly can be. Cade Klubnik wrestled that quarterback job away from DJ Uiagalelei toward the end of last season, got some experience, played 22% of snaps, not bad for a former 5-star guy getting his feet wet a little bit as a true freshman. Got to start in the bowl game and was able to be the guy going into the offseason, as according to fall camp reports, really taking on a real leadership role there. So the quarterback position seems like they've figured it out, right? Have not only the talent, but got him a little experience and went out and got a play caller that should be able to really build the offense around Cade Klubnik's skill set. And Garrett Riley's had a pretty fast rise, as a play caller, as an assistant coach. He's been at East Carolina and Appalachian State, SMU, and then, of course, last year at TCU. And one thing that I think maybe flew under the radar just a little bit, part of the success that he had at TCU last year, he changed things up just a little bit. At SMU, the previous 2 seasons, the pace at which they ran offensively, was like a top 20 pace. Last year, they were in the bottom half of the FBS in terms of time between snaps. I run all those numbers against FBS opponents only and what have you, but it slowed it down a bit, and that sort of fit I think the talent on hand and sort of what it seemed like he needed to make a few adjustments to put TCU in a position to be competitive and win, and really greatly overachieved what most people's expectations were. He inherits now a team at Clemson with Cade Klubnik at quarterback, probably in terms of raw talent, we would say is a better quarterback than Max Duggan. And then the skill positions, Quentin Johnston was absolutely a special player. But
Nick, let me ask you a question, because you talked about the pace of play, and we know that these offenses that run a bunch of plays in a game, that they often score a lot of points. Why do you think that there was the difference between Garrett Riley's play calling at SMU versus the slower play calling at TCU?
Well, I think it's just the talent on hand, the level of competition, a little bit of a step up in the Big 12 where there were no easy weeks. Had to get a little creative. Expectations were not high at TCU coming into last year. They were coming off actually a losing season. Duggan wasn't the starter at quarterback to begin the year. Chandler Morris gets hurt. So it seemed like a situation to me where he did a good job just sort of reacting to what he had to work with, but then, some adversity as it popped up as well. And just one of the things that was a little bit of a byproduct was slowing things down a little bit. And that worked for TCU. Sounds like, that's not necessarily what they're doing right now at Clemson, but wouldn't surprise me at all if, for whatever reason, Garrett Riley looks around and, maybe they have an injury or something like that. And kind of adjusts on the fly. It seems like that's a real strength of his, to me, is to tailor his philosophy, his play calling. He's not married to just one thing. He wants to find whatever his unit, his team is going to do to be most successful, and then operate that way.
As a company, we have been very high on Clemson slot wide receiver Antonio Williams, who was a freshman last year and is going to be a true sophomore this year. But as I mentioned, there was another second-year player in Adam Randall, who is a specimen athletically, and then Bo Collins is also a big, lanky, wide-ranging wide receiver on the other outside wide receiver position. In the backfield, they have a very dynamic duo between Phil Maffa, who's a more north and south runner, and Will Shipley, who the comps coming out of high school were Christian McCaffrey because of his athleticism and ability to catch the ball. Is there any particular position, Nick, in this offense that you see first-year offensive coordinator going to make things a little bit different, a player that you see potentially breaking out and having an outstanding season in 2023 for this Clemson Tiger team?
So I haven't quite made up my mind how I see the wide receiver pecking order playing out. I think Antonio Williams probably should be considered the favorite, but he's of course a different type of player than what we saw Garrett Riley work with and feature like Quentin Johnston last year. If you're looking for the body type, what have you, is Bo Collins a little more in that range? Maybe Adam Randall's just sort of a different thing altogether. But we'll see. As I mentioned, Lincoln Riley, I think, has a pretty has shown that he's got a knack for tailoring the system to the strengths of the players that he's got. Last year he turned Miller into one of the best running backs in college football, right? Somewhat unexpectedly, Kendre Miller. So Will Shipley is I think a player who's proven that he's got a pretty unique skill set, as you mentioned, as a pass catcher, has been productive. I'm interested to see what Lincoln Riley can do to maybe help him take his game to the next level, but also there's certainly the potential where he looks at it and he says, yeah, I've got two of the better running backs in the ACC. Let's find ways to utilize them on the field at the same time. I'm also really curious to see what he does with an athletic tight end like Jake Brennenstuhl, who TCU didn't necessarily have a player with his receiving ability at that position last year. So SMU, he had a pretty good little run of tight ends that were highly productive there. So that's, I think, something to watch as well. Pretty interested to see what he can do with a player like that.
I find Dabo Swinney fascinating because of his coaching philosophies, because of his staunch Christian beliefs and his the medical program there, the witchcraft that they're employing down there in Clemson to get these players. 2 seasons in a row, they've had like severe spring injuries, and those players have been back by the fall. It was Tyson Pumachan in 2021 who tore his Achilles and then played that season. And tore his Achilles in the spring game and then played in the fall. I have no idea how that happened. And then Adam Randall tore his ACL in the spring and then played in the fall. I don't know what they're doing down there at Clemson. I bet you that the NFL is tracking and trying to figure out what Drake Maye is doing, the third-year player at North Carolina. The question being is this guy someone who just took advantage of lesser competition, or is he truly a franchise caliber player? 4,000 yards passing, actually 4,300 yards passing last season, 38 touchdowns, 7 interceptions. But I think the thing that people don't realize about Drake Maye is the fact that he is actually a dual threat. He had more rushing yards last year than Caleb Williams, almost 700. I don't think that most people would peg between Drake Maye and Caleb Williams, Drake Maye being the dual threat. He absolutely is. He faded down the stretch. Completion percentage of 51% in the San Diego County Credit Union Bowl against an Oregon team that was really hot at the end of the year. 61% completion percentage and 2 interceptions against Clemson, which was probably the best defense that he faced last year. That was in December. And in November, playing North Carolina State, NC State, again, less than 60% completion, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. So really, really, fading down the stretch. What's your take on Drake Maye, Nick? Because I've seen some folks even consider him to be better than Caleb Williams. Caleb Williams being widely regarded as the number 1 pick next year. What do you see in Drake Maye? How do you assess his talent?
Well, I think he's obviously incredibly talented. I don't know that I've got a strong opinion. I don't know if I'm ready to say that he's better than Caleb Williams. But I think he pretty clearly is, on the very, very short list of best quarterbacks in college football. My big question is, how is his supporting cast going to play out this year? Because, of course, we learned this past week that Devontae Walker currently is ineligible. He was expected to step in and be probably Drake Maye's top target this year. They, of course, lost Josh Downs. I wonder a little bit, if some uncertainty, some new faces, maybe it takes a little while to get, the timing down and all that good stuff. If that's going to potentially impact Drake Maye. I haven't figured out quite yet if he's the type of guy who is just so supremely talented that he's able to completely raise the level, of play around him. And as you mentioned at the end of last year, certainly didn't seem like he did that. Seemed like things kind of stagnated a little bit. But I think we'll find out pretty quick, especially if Walker is unavailable early in the season, if he's that kind of player. I think Caleb Williams is. I think he proved that a little bit last year. I'm not sure Drake Maye maybe hasn't had the opportunity to do that yet, but I think he probably will.
I want to touch on, if you haven't been paying attention, Devontae Walker is a transfer from Kent State. He's 6'2", 200 pounds, probably runs a 4.45 somewhere in there. He is a speed threat, a deep threat. I think that the NFL comp for him is probably, Christian Watson-ish. He transferred to North Carolina and applied for to be immediately eligible. However, in 2020, he played at a JUCO. He played at a JUCO in North Carolina. They didn't have their season because of COVID. 2019, they didn't have their 2020, they didn't have their season. After that season, he transfers to Kent State, and he played the last 2 years at Kent State. Applies for the NCAA, initially granted his waiver to be immediately eligible, and then pulled it back, and then pulled the waiver back. And so now, at the moment, his eligibility is in question. So we don't know if we're going to see him this year, but look to be the best wide receiver through camp and through the spring game, produced in the spring game. If Drake Maye loses Devontae Walker, he probably doesn't have that alpha dog that he had last year, different type of wide receiver that he had in Josh Downs. But they were looking for Devontae Walker to be that number 1 guy for them. Yeah. All right, let's before we go to break here, I got to tell you about the FSGA College Football Fantasy Draft. We're kicking off the college football season with a live fantasy draft. The FSGA College Football Fantasy Draft, featuring the top college football analysts and drafting the best players for the 2023 season, hosted by Campus2Canton. That's us. Well, it wasn't me. It was Austin and Matt and Chris. Follow the pick-by-pick coverage and strategies, plus interviews with the participants on the Better Sports Network YouTube channel. Search FSGA College Fantasy Draft. That thing did really, really well. If you didn't notice, college fantasy is growing, Nick. I don't know if you knew that or not, but college fantasy is growing. That mock draft did particularly well. And if you haven't seen it, you need to go. You need to get in the College Fantasy League this year and check out that video. When we come back, we're going to go through the quarterback position, the running back position, and see, who it is that we like. We've talked to a few of these guys, but we're going to go through team by team. It's Nicholas Ian Allen, Felix Sharpe. This is the Campus2Canton show on Better Sports Network.
Campus2Canton on the Better Sports Network.
So let's get into some best ball philosophy here.
Yeah.
In your experience, going back many, many, many years, drafting in national tournaments, Bradley, have you historically been shying away from the running back position in favor of wide receivers? In favor of, if you're drafting in the FFPC tight end premium format, in favor of tight ends as well. Is that the smart play when you're drafting this early in the drafting season?
Yeah, so taking value is going to be huge, and looking at like running backs and wide receivers, like you want to take a look at how the structure is. So you mentioned earlier the FFPC has a couple different types, like they've got super flex and one quarterback, and so that's going to change your strategy a little bit if you have only 2 wide receivers or if you're drafting 3 wide receivers. And of course, the PPR is a different aspect compared to other formats or other tournaments. And so keeping in mind the pass catching upside of some of the running backs may be more valuable in those formats. So the Austin Ecklers, the Christian McCaffreys may be more value because they get more receptions, and so like I loved taking late shots a couple years ago on like the JD McKissicks of the world who would get 50 receptions really cheaply. So that's something to consider. But when it comes to like overall value, like you're drafting, you're in the middle of a draft, and you just noticed that, I don't know, maybe it's Chris Godwin has fallen 14 spots, but Chris Godwin was not in your plans to be drafting. Like maybe you don't have a strong player take on Chris Godwin, or my take is that I don't think the Bucs are going to be particularly good this year. But for him to be dropping, let's say 14 spots, is more than a full round. And based on the data that we've seen, if you get to draft a player more than 12 spots ahead or behind ADP, so they drop 12 or more spots, you have an 84% edge over the rest of the tournament players who are drafting this player. Because typically this player isn't going to drop. The average draft position is a really strong indicator of where a player is going to go. And I think that is also on the flip side. If you are reaching too much, you're giving up value in your drafts. And so when it comes to value-based drafting, you need to consider, just because this guy isn't my plans or I don't have a strong player take on him, maybe that's your opportunity to sprinkle in some shares of this player at a good price.
Or the uninitiated. Will Chudy, our producer, 1, he keeps us in line, make sure we don't get fired. And 2, he reviews our performance in the prior segment with our rejoin music. And so if he liked the segment, he gives us rejoin music. And if he doesn't, he gives us, yakety sex. Now, there's a little bit of a caveat to that. Before we were playing, now we're playing like no royalty music. So I was wondering if I was going to be able to tell if Will liked the segment or not, but I think he did. I think that music was him telling us good job. Nick, you did particularly good.
Thank you. First time. Happy to be here.
I was talking with Austin about the ACC, and I'm like, outside of a few teams, I don't know if the sex appeal is necessarily there in the ACC outside of, Florida State, Clemson, and UNC. Maybe I'm wrong. We already talked about Cade Klubnik being at Clemson, Jordan Travis at Florida State. At Louisville, Jeff Brom comes back to his hometown from Purdue, and along with him, he brings some transfer quarterbacks, Jack Plummer, Brock Doman, and there's a Pierce Clarkston, who is a freshman from St. John Bosco in California. St. John Bosco is one of the premier high school programs in the country. Pierce Clarkston, before he came here, I'm in Louisville. He put billboards all around the city kind of touting his coming and his commitment to the city, which is really cool. But now he's got a couple of guys in front of him that he did not necessarily expect to be there. I don't want to ask you specifically about Louisville, the quarterback situation there, but what should someone expect from a Jeff Brom quarterback situation, Nick? He's a guy that we've seen, a lot from at Purdue, and I know that you would be familiar. Like, what should the expectations be from that quarterback room, regardless of who it ends up being?
Pretty high, just simply. Jeff Brom has got a really, really strong track record at the quarterback position. And, the last 3 years that was focused on really Aiden O'Connell was kind of wrestled that job away for the most part to the last 3 years, but Jack Plummer, was part of that rotation as well. And, him coming back potentially, solidifies that spot, someone who's familiar with the offense. But, Aiden O'Connell, who was a walk-on, was an unrated player. Jeff Brom, the last 2 seasons, was able to turn him into, basically a 3,500 yard passer, had 50 total touchdowns over the last 2 seasons. So, from a just pure yardage standpoint, there's a lot of value there at the quarterback position. And I think that Plummer is actually, even though he wasn't able to hold off Aiden O'Connell, a little more talented. And, now that he's got 2 extra years of experience, including last year away from Jeff Brom, now coming back and reconnecting, I'm wondering if they'll be able to take things to another level, because I do think that Louisville also probably has a little bit more to work with at the receiver group, at least on paper, compared to what Jack Plummer specifically has had to work with the last couple of years.
Jeff Brom and the Brom family from Louisville. They went to Trinity High School, which is one of the 2 prestigious Catholic schools here in the city. St. X is the other one, but Trinity High School also. Rondale Moore, Cardinals wide receiver Rondale Moore, an alumni of Trinity High School. Let's go to another interesting backfield quarterback room in NC State. Now, NC State, I think, who's the quarterback that just transferred to Kentucky? It's so hard to remember some of these names. So they bring in, anyway, NC State brings in Brennan Armstrong from UVA. Brennan Armstrong had the best season of his career in 2021 with Robert Anae, the offensive coordinator there at Virginia. Robert Anae left Virginia, went to Syracuse, had Garrett Schrader have his best season of his career, and now Robert Anae moves for the 3rd time in 3 years. He's now the offensive coordinator at NC State. He reunites with Brennan Armstrong. They have a really strong quarterback room between Armstrong and MJ Morris. Nick, I don't know how to tee up the question, but if we're talking about being excited about offense, Robert Anae and Brennan Armstrong pairing together again, that should give NC State fans a reason to be excited.
Yeah, absolutely. When they were together in 2021, Brennan Armstrong was a 4,500 yard passer, nearly 30 touchdowns through the air, averaged over 400 passing yards, and then was really productive, as a runner as well. Had 400 rushing yards and 9 touchdowns at the quarterback position under Anae there at Virginia, as you mentioned. So I think that, one, we saw Brennan Armstrong, without Robert Anae last season, and there was just a sharp drop off in his level of production. So getting them, back together again, not saying they're going to be that elite level of production that they were able to combine to make Armstrong have such a special season in 2021. But I do think that we're going to see a really, really strong bounce back performance from Brennan Armstrong, being comfortable in the system, comfortable with the play caller. It's just going to be how he adjusts to new surroundings, being at NC State.
Yeah, and I'd be remiss not to mention MJ Morris, just another, again, a sophomore in a 2-game stretch playing Virginia Tech and Wake Forest. He threw in those 2 games, threw for about 450 yards, 6 touchdowns, no interceptions, and had a completion percentage of about, looks like 67%. He is, even though he's a backup, he is a quarterback that we have as a company in our top 30 or so. We expect big things from MJ Morris if and when he becomes the starter. He's also a little bit of a dual threat. He can run also. At Wake Forest, we saw Sam Hartman transfer to Notre Dame. That leaves Mitch Griffiths there to run the slow mesh. And if you haven't watched a lot of Wake Forest, you should know that basically the quarterback and the running back after the snap kind of walk up to the line of scrimmage in this very slow mesh. And when your linebackers and safeties come up to stop the run, that's when they throw it behind you. We saw Mitch Griffiths play last year in relief of Sam Hartman, who missed a game or 2. I can't remember. It was a medical condition that he ended up coming back from. But we kind of expect the train to keep on rolling there for Wake Forest, given how Griffiths played last year.
I do. Yeah, for sure. I mean, week 1 against VMI, so not the highest quality opponent, but Mitch Griffiths got that start with Hartman being out, put up just about as solid of a stat line as you could expect. 21 of 29, 288 yards, nearly 10 yards per pass attempt, 3 touchdowns, 0 interceptions. And, the rest of the way didn't get into nearly as many games, but still continued to look like he was a solid heir to this position. So with Hartman moving on, Wake Forest under Dave Clawson has had a pretty strong track record. Before Hartman, there was Jamie Newman, right, who got some buzz as
transferred to
first
Georgia,
round NFL draft, right? Yeah, so
that's right.
And then ends up not getting drafted, not playing after transferring to Georgia, which potentially impacted that. But that shows me, I think, a little bit that Dave Clawson is able to take a quarterback who might not be perfect, might not be an elite talent, because Sam Hartman certainly is not, and is able to put them in a situation where they can be incredibly productive. Mitch Griffiths, I think, has shown us that he can operate this system quite well. It was a very small sample size, but I am pretty optimistic. Not necessarily expecting they're going to be a top 5 passing offense. They graded out as a top 5 unit in my passing offense team performance numbers last year. I could see a little bit of a step back, especially with some of the transition at wide receiver. But I do think that we're going to continue to see production and quality quarterback play pretty much as long as Dave Clawson is involved.
I think it's fair to say that Wake Forest is one of these teams that's like a modern day Nebraska, where the scheme creates production. If you're old enough to remember Nebraska running the option with Eric Crouch when Eric Crouch won the Heisman Trophy, Wake Forest, it's a different system, but it's a system that works, that really works and creates production. I want to go to Miami. I want to go to South Florida, because Tyler Van Dyke is a player that I touted that 2021 season when he was backing up De'Aaron King and wasn't even really scheduled to be the backup. He was fighting for that job with Jake Garcia, who was a highly touted recruit at the time, who had originally committed to USC before flipping his commitment to Miami, and now he's at Missouri. But in the midst of that speculation, I was really high on Tyler Van Dyke. With Rhett Lashley at the helm, Rhett Lashley is now the head coach at SMU. He was the offensive coordinator at the time under Manny Diaz. Tyler Van Dyke was throwing bomb after bomb to one Charleston Rambo and Mike Harley. What did they do after that 21 season? They bring in Mario Cristobal. Mario Cristobal, a defensive-oriented head coach. Of course, there at Oregon had Justin Herbert. A lot of us thought that Justin Herbert wasn't that dude because we never really saw the ceiling that he's shown in the NFL in college. So that was the first red flag for Tyler Van Dyke, is the fact that they brought in Mario Cristobal. The second red flag is that they hired one Josh Gaddis as the offensive coordinator from Michigan. And I've talked a lot on this show. I think that Michigan is built on a house of cards, and if they don't change their offensive philosophies, they will not be able to recruit with the likes of USC, Ohio State, Alabama, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, it was one and done for Josh Gaddis at Miami. Tyler Van Dyke kind of fell apart last year. They bring in a new offensive coordinator. I think they fired a bunch of assistants at Miami after year one. It's not just the offensive coordinator. They bring in a new OC in Shannon Dawson, who is a Dana Holgorsen disciple. And I think Dana Holgorsen was the head coach when West Virginia had its heyday with Pat White and Steve Slayton and, all of those guys. So I think that we can expect a little bit more of a spread, a little more passing the ball, maybe Nick, leaning more towards Tyler Van Dyke's strengths, and maybe he can recapture some of that magic that we saw in 2021 when he came on for relief of De'Aaron King.
Yeah, I think it's possible. Shannon Dawson does have, you mentioned the tie to Holgorsen, an air raid background, not necessarily the, throw it all the time air raid. We've seen productive running games, specifically at Houston. Shannon Dawson was at Houston the last 4 years, Southern Miss prior to that, Kentucky and West Virginia in his background as well. I think that there is reason to be optimistic. You mentioned, Mario Cristobal sort of as the head coach and whether or not his philosophy lines up with, maybe the strength of Tyler Van Dyke. And I have sort of a little bit of a theory. I think that, from a offensive standpoint and for a lot of what we discuss for fantasy football at the college level specifically, a defensive minded head coach is definitely a red flag. Well, Mario Cristobal being an offensive line coach in some ways is even worse, because in my experience, offensive line coaches are pretty dead set most of the time on, hey, let's just run the ball. So when you've got a guy like Tyler Van Dyke, who can stretch the field and really has a lot of tools that would play well in a Shannon Dawson type air raid system potentially, it just didn't necessarily seem like a great match. And Josh Gaddis, as you mentioned, not the right fit there as well. So I'm hopeful that Tyler Van Dyke is going to be able to bounce back. Somewhat similar to the conversation that we had earlier about Drake Maye. I wonder just a little bit if the skill position group around him is going to help him get to the level that he's capable of. Really liked what we saw out of Colby Young last year. Big target, looks like a legitimate rising number one receiver, but the rest of the group really kind of underperformed. And so I'm wondering, is Xavier Restrepo, is a newcomer like Tyler Harrell, who has that elite top end speed, are they going to be able to put together enough around Tyler Van Dyke? And will Shannon Dawson, with his offensive philosophy, or at least background that is a little more geared toward that, maybe we'll be able to unlock this offense. I think it's very possible. I think there's plenty of talent, and Van Dyke, as you mentioned, has a really, really high ceiling. So hopefully this is a major step in the right direction. But then I do kind of have a little bit of hesitancy about Mario Cristobal, and will he kind of eventually return to maybe his comfort zone and say, you know what, maybe let's slow it down. Maybe let's run the football a little bit more and not necessarily play into what looks to be the biggest strength he's got at his disposal in Tyler Van Dyke.
I forgot about Tyler Harrell. I want to put a pin in that because we're going to go to break. Tyler Harrell, really good story. But we'll get into it when we come back. It's Nicholas Ian Allen, Felix Sharpe. This is Campus2Canton on Better Sports Network.
feel like this is a quietly contentious point in dynasty fantasy football, what it means to actually be rebuilding. Some people say you should never truly be rebuilding. How do you view the rebuilding versus competing dichotomy in dynasty?
So I will be the first person to acknowledge that my preferred format of fantasy football is just redraft. The years that I have played dynasty, it has been, I've drafted a win now team because I've seen people that have just gotten into the cycle of rebuilding and thus they just don't make any progress. So if you're rebuilding for the 5th year in a row, I just, I don't know exactly how you get out of it, but yeah, it's definitely something that can happen. And a lot of people, especially when we come out of the NFL draft, everyone's just instantly shipping off, draft picks and everything. So, I mean, it's definitely something that can happen.
Joey, do you feel similarly to it? Do you feel like you see people getting stuck in the rebuilding loop?
I mean, I would say people that try to rebuild in the beginning of seasons, of their fantasy seasons, I see them get stuck in that rut. I would really try to only ever rebuild if I knew I was going to miss the playoffs. Like, I'm always trying to play to win, even if it's maybe I don't know.
I think my big thing is the word rebuild is a much shorter time frame than I think most people say it should be. Like, they look at rebuild as like 3 years out competing. Rebuild, you're looking to compete next season. You know what I mean? Like, if you're doing it now, you're looking to revamp, and maybe there's a one season where you ship it off, but that very next season you should be competing. If you're doing it like that, I'm cool with it, but you gotta have a plan, not just keep getting the young players, keep getting the draft picks. Otherwise, you end up like Tim. Maybe not like Tim who gets a bye, but you make the playoffs, you're in that like 4 to 6 range every year, just hovering in the middle. Nothing ever gets better, nothing ever gets worse.
I think I play like you in Dynasty, Simon. I play in 3-year windows.
100%. That's my go-to. And with the rate at which dynasty leagues turn over, you should really only ever play in a 3-year window.
I can't tell with that one. I feel like this is us being criticized for our performance now. I think that's what it is, but it's hard to tell because it's this royalty-free music. Fantasy Alarm All-Pro subscription plus Fantasy Football Draft Guide cheat sheet. Start a 7-day free trial of Fantasy Alarm's All-Pro subscription and get the Fantasy Football Draft Guide and cheat sheet free. Go to fantasyalarm.com/draft. That's fantasyalarm.com/draft. You mentioned Tyler Harrell at the end of the last segment, and I just had to go back and look at his stats. So I thought I remembered this correctly, but I couldn't remember. He averaged 30 yards a catch in 2021 for the Louisville Cardinals. That performance got him essentially an audition with Alabama. He transferred to Alabama, and I think he dealt with injury last year and didn't play. The fact that he is at Miami now is just, I'm not remembering that. And that is what Tyler Van Dyke had in Charleston Rambo, the deep threat for Miami in that 2021 season. Tyler Harrell has all of that speed and should be an asset to help Tyler Van Dyke recreate some of that magic in 2023. I don't want to just one player that I want to mention before we skip over the quarterbacks, and we skipped over a lot. We skipped over Riley Leonard, excuse me. We didn't talk about him. He's considered to be a potential day one NFL draft pick. I don't know if I feel that way myself, but I do want to mention him. And I also want to go to Boston College and not even talk about their starter. I want to talk about Thomas Castellanos real quick. Thomas Castellanos, a second-year player from Ware County in Georgia, who's just a dynamic backyard-type football. Johnny Manziel, Russell Wilson will turn his back to the line of scrimmage and make plays. Just an exciting football player. Was with Gus Malzahn's UCF team last year, and I actually thought that was the perfect fit for him. He decides to jump ship, and he transfers to Boston College. Even if he's not the starter, which I don't think that he is pegged to be the starter this year, I could see him having some packages given his dynamic athleticism, was in the same backfield as Iowa State starting running back Cartavius Norton in high school. They played together. So watch out for Thomas Castellanos. Let's go to the running back position here. And I think that we're talking about Will Shipley and Phil Moffa at the top and Trey Benson. And then it's just some guys in this conference. I could be wrong, but that's what it feels like. Austin is a fan of Jawar Jordan at Louisville, has drafted him in a bunch of places. Nick, I kind of want to just throw out a broad question for you. As far as the running back position goes from this conference, are there guys that you're targeting, that you're drafting more than others, more than the names that we kind of readily understand to be good?
There is a little bit of a drop off. I haven't, not to say that others have necessarily given up on Will Shipley, but I think that there's still the potential for him to be a top tier running back. Actually seems to be, believe it or not, a little bit undervalued in the CFF.
People think he's soft. The complaint is that he's a soft player. So
hey, I can't. I don't know, but I think that the skill set is there, and I think that perhaps this move, as far as Garrett Riley coming in, could have the potential to sort of unlock him and use him to the best of his skill set. But I agree that the depth at the running back position at the ACC isn't as great as it could be. I do like Trey Benson. I actually still have a little bit of a soft spot for Lawrence Toafili. I mean, guys that can speed guys who can make plays, in the receiving game out of the backfield. I tend to like that's part of. I agree with Austin that Jawar Jordan, who is just a speed guy, think that he's got a little bit of that as well. From a CFF standpoint, the one kind of oddly enough, who I've drafted maybe more often than not, is Justice Ellison of Wake Forest. And a big part of that is just he's basically free at the end of drafts. And that running back room has really kind of cleared out a little bit due to transfers the last couple of years. So, but otherwise, I mean, yeah, there's not a ton that, or not a lot of situations that really scream to me, okay, this guy's going to get a really heavy workload. I mean, yeah, maybe LaQuint Allen at Syracuse, but even then, I'm usually a little skeptical of guys that have very little track record at the college level. And then a lot of other places, I mean, Rodney Hammond, I guess, is probably in that.
Rodney Hammond at Pitt.
And have been reading that Pitt is not necessarily going back to the Kenny Pickett, Mark Whipple days of a few years ago where they were putting up such big passing numbers, but it does sound like they're potentially going to be leaning into the pass a little bit more than they did last year. So he's probably, second, or maybe I guess third behind Shipley and Benson for me. But the other situations, they're pretty crowded. North Carolina, you've got 5 guys listed here, and all of them could get carries. Duke is a pretty even split with 2 to 3 guys. North Carolina State potentially set up to be a split. Hasn't really been very productive so far, or in recent history. Last couple of years, at least, with Jordan Houston, Michael Allen. Not exactly sure how that's going to shake out. So, I feel like beyond that top tier, either I don't love the situation, or there's just a pretty clear drop off in just overall talent, quite honestly.
I don't necessarily disagree with you. I have a soft spot for thick, big butt, big thigh running backs. And not only does that describe Amarian Hampton, but Amarian Hampton was the Gatorade Player of the Year, I believe, for the state of North Carolina his senior year in high school before going to North Carolina. And he actually started his college career out with a bang as a true freshman. I think he had at least 2 games with over 100 yards. Now, one of them was against Florida A&M, if I remember correctly, so a lower level of competition. But, I mean, this is a talented player who, offers a thunder and could probably use a lightning complement. But I'm a big fan of Amarian Hampton, given his size is probably 230 pounds, 6 foot, 230 pounds, somewhere in there. Sean Tucker, if you play in college fantasy, Mr. himself, who's always pleased with his performance, who's now with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, he is being replaced by LaQuint Allen. LaQuint Allen, who had 15 carries for 94 yards in the Pinstripe Bowl in relief of him, but he also had 11 catches for 60 yards. That's a big deal in fantasy when you have a running back that can catch passes that way. He also had a 100-yard game earlier in the season last year in a 59-0 blowout against Wagner. So I would watch out for LaQuint Allen at the running back position. But I mean, other than that, I mean, as Nick said, let me take that back. I am a fan of Jordan Houston. I know that he's been around for a long time. I thought that he was an explosive player. He didn't have the season at Jordan Houston at NC State. Maybe with Robert and I there as offensive coordinator, that offense is a little more up-tempo. He gets more opportunities in the red zone, more opportunities to catch the ball. Jordan Houston is diminutive, but an explosive player. I would look out for him. All right. I think that kind of, to the extent we can make some broad sweeping generalizations about the running back position in the ACC, I think that we've done that. And we got to quickly get here through the wide receiver position and tight end. Let's see, where would I start here? Where would I start? I think it's natural to start with North Carolina, given that I think the single best talent in the conference, in my opinion, is probably Devontae Walker. Now he's not going to be there. They have 2 players who kind of profile as slot wide receivers, and Nate McCollum, who transferred from Georgia Tech, and then Kobe Paysor, who was already there, and Kobe Paysor has stepped in for Josh Downs and has performed well in relief of Josh Downs. Nick, if Devontae Walker's not there, is the wide receiver core going to be all right without, their big alpha speed threat on the outside?
I think it's got potential. I do like Paysor and with Chip Lindsey now calling the plays, Phil Longo moved on to Wisconsin. It's not clear that the slot position is going to be quite as valuable. There really isn't a more valuable or consistent slot system than what Phil Longo puts together. So that might limit Paysor a little bit, though I do think that we saw him step in, as you mentioned, for Downs and performed quite well. J.J. Jones is experienced, not exactly the most productive. Gavin Blackwell, it sounds like, is working his way into the top rotation early in spring practices. Andre Green Jr., highly rated player coming out of high school, was a little surprised at how little we saw from him last season. But oddly enough, and I know that Chip Lindsey doesn't have a great track record utilizing the tight end position, but I do kind of hold out hope that most coaches are smart enough to use their most talented players in position groups, and they've got 2 to 3 really solid tight ends. Kamari Morales, sounds like Jake Copenhaver is really performing well this spring, and then I absolutely love Bryson Nesbitt. I know that he's maybe not practicing super well, it sounds like right now, but believe that he's got in a lot of ways wide receiver skills, and potentially could emerge as more or less a full-time receiver, especially if Devontae Walker is unavailable. I think that him being that big target and is athletic enough, in my opinion, to do it. I think that they've got the potential to cobble together something, getting creative with some inexperienced guys at the receiver group, and maybe even utilizing the tight end possession a little more, or potentially even, moving Nesbitt to more of a traditional receiver role.
Yeah, a lot of Bryson Nesbitt is a player that's been going fairly early for the tight end position in college fantasy football drafts. I forgot, I should have mentioned the fact that UNC loses offensive coordinator Phil Longo to Wisconsin. Phil Longo has had success, a long track record of success, including at North Carolina, at Ole Miss. How do I ask this? Do you think there's going to be a substantial difference in performance for North Carolina, given that they're going from Phil Longo to Chip Lindsey, who does not have the same track record for production?
So I do some fairly in-depth projections for teams and players that look at sort of 3-year windows for the team, the play caller, and the head coach. And so I can kind of see, side by side, who've been the top performers for Phil Longo, which the last 3 years at North Carolina were all 1,000-yard receivers. The last 2 years were, 90, 100 catches. And for Chip Lindsey, his track record previously at UCF last season and prior to that at Troy, there's a drop off. You can cut the touchdown production for the number 1 receiver in half. You can pretty much cut it in half for the number 2 receiver as well. And they're just not, as explosive if you're looking yards per catch, yards per target, that sort of thing. Phil Longo's guys just completely outperform what Chip Lindsey has done. However, Chip Lindsey hasn't had Drake Maye before. So I wonder, and that's part of why I do take into account, the team history as well. I kind of believe that, or at least am hopeful, he's smart enough. He's going to be able to figure out how to take a lot of the successful things North Carolina's done under Phil Longo and incorporate them into his system and set them up for a chance to be successful and productive as well.
If I think I'm remembering about the right offensive coordinator here, but I think Chip Lindsey was the offensive coordinator at Southern Miss when Nick Mullins was the quarterback there. So, he's put one guy in the NFL. I could be, I might be, don't quote me on that. I could be misremembering that. I want to ask you about, this is a very easy either or question as we close out here tonight. Which wide receiver core are you taking? Florida State's with Johnny Wilson, Keon Coleman, Jaheim Bell. Those are the guys that we think will, command a lot of the offensive production in the receiving game, or Clemson's with the aforementioned Antonio Williams, Bo Collins, Adam Randall, and Jake Brunningstool. If you had to pick one of these programs and run with their wide receivers for the season, who would it be?
I think I have a better grasp on what Florida State is as a receiving core. I love Johnny Wilson. I know not everybody does, but I've seen him take over a game. I think Keon Coleman is going to be a great compliment to him. And I've seen the production out of those two guys. Feel a little bit better about where they sit right now than I do for Clemson.
I'm going to take Florida State also, and I'll tell you why. Because I really like the fact that Jaheim Bell can play wide receiver, tight end, running back, whatever he wants. All right. We will be with you next week, getting closer to college football season, everybody. Peace.
It's good. It's good. The job is done. We can go home now.